Dr. Robert Brown. Okay, so Professor Dr. Robert Brown is back with us because we've been doing this series of unpacking the state of urban Connecticut 2019 through a COVID lens. And so we've had some good conversations, Dr. Brown. Nice
Yeah,
to
we
see
have.
you.
Good to see you too. Good morning, Harry. How are you?
Good morning. Now I'm
So
going to do my disappearing act. I thought I was already gone.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
So today, Dr. Brown, we are talking about housing and health disparities
Yes.
from the state of urban Connecticut
Yes.
through a COVID lens,
Yes.
which I think is appropriate to talk about as we are seeing record numbers of people being evicted being evicted at the same time. This money is kind of hitting their accounts, although these banks are holding this money until tomorrow, which is real crazy.
It's a very interesting time, and again, I'd like to ask your indulgence by reading something to you that I think sets the stage for our conversation today.
Yes.
Black America is in a state of crisis. By any of the accepted indicators of progress, employment, housing, education, many of the gains Blacks made over the past decade were either wiped out or badly eroded, and the portents for the future are not encouraging. True, on a limited and individual basis, there were exceptions to this downward trend, but the growing number of Blacks without jobs, the increasing gap between white and Black income, new public displays of racism, and the negative attitude of policymakers toward programs that aid the poor marked the year as one of increasing hardships for Black America. Without question, much of the responsibility for many of the reverses sustained by Blacks lay with the economy. Blacks suffered disproportionately because of their low position on the economic ladder, as unemployment climbed to depression levels in many of their communities and inflation cut into their already limited purchasing power. But this is only part of the story of what happened to Black America. The other has to do with the rapidly drying up of the nation's willingness to face up to the seriousness of the problems that years of racism have created, and to deal with these problems with the intensity and commitment their solution demands. The implications of this should not be lost on the American people, for the future of this nation is bound up in how it deals with these problems. To be remembered is that other societies have disintegrated when they ignored signs of spreading poverty and disenchantment among their people. It can happen in America, but it does not have to do so. The hour is late, but there is yet time to set the American house in order. And that, Babz, are the words of the late, great Vernon E. Jordan Jr. on the occasion of the launching of the State of Black America in 1976.
Wow.
So 45 years ago, we were where we seem to still remain. And
that sounds like you wrote that yesterday.
It sounds like you wrote it yesterday. And when looking at the legislation that was passed and signed by President Biden last week, that is going to go a long way to help provide some immediate relief. It's also going to help, I think, lift for the first time significant numbers of people from poverty, but it's just the first step. When looking at a state such as Connecticut, we know that there are extremes sometimes in wealth disparity. And one of the ways that we measure this is the ability of a person or family to live in housing that's safe and affordable.
Mm-hmm.
But when looking at Connecticut, and generally speaking, I should say, the housing authorities place acceptable levels of rents at 30% of a person or a family's income, take-home income. But when you begin to get beyond the 30% threshold, Babz, we're talking about 35 and 40%. We're now talking about a person or family who is considered rent burden. In other words, a much larger portion of their income is going to rent. But for those who are what we call severely rent burdened, they are paying in excess of 50% of their income. So if we look at the New Haven region, for example, and this was the data that came out of State of Urban Connecticut. So this is going back 2 years to 2019. We found that nearly 60% of residents in the New Haven region were rent burdened. That is 50% or more, severely rent burdened, I should say. And that number is even higher. It went up to as much as 70% for people who were living in very low income neighborhoods. So we had an existential crisis even then. And as the affordable housing section of the report went on to show, was that an affordable housing wage for this state would be $25 an hour. Now, this was pre-COVID. And so obviously now that situation has become even more dire when you've had people who have been evicted, when you've had the cessation of the moratoriums on paying rent. And I should say to any of your viewers who may need immediate assistance, I would urge you to dial 211. That's 211, which is a number for the Connecticut United Ways. And they can offer relief and services and get you to the agencies that can provide some mechanisms of help. Because I know that even though these checks are coming and they should have already started to hit some people's bank accounts, we know that people have been in dire need for many, many months. It should also be noted that persons who have direct deposit access will get those checks first. So what does that mean? For those who do not have a banking relationship or who are unbanked, they will be waiting to get those checks the longest period of time. So it's really important.
Something wrong with my
I can see you, but it looks like your screen is frozen.
Yeah, she's frozen.
Okay.
You could continue. She'll join us again.
Okay. I was saying that for those who may need immediate assistance to dial 211, which is Connecticut United Way, and they are across the state, but they can provide services and resources for people who may need immediate assistance with rent, utilities, food, and the like.
So when we talk about so how come, Dr. Brown, that we are stuck on this $15 an hour and we're not talking about what it requires for people to pay rent, a decent rent in that, whatever that threshold is, that 30% threshold of their income? How come we're not having that conversation? Where did it go wrong where we use to say or acknowledge that people are struggling and that paying 70% of your income in rent is outrageous and almost criminal?
Lack of empathy. I mean, it's the lack of empathy and compassion. I think that the idea of asking someone to live off, say, $7.25, which is the current federal minimum wage, or even going up to the $15 minimum wage, which won't happen for a while. I mean, obviously, there are some locales that do have a $15 minimum wage, the nation's capital being one. And of course, the minimum wage here in Connecticut will go to $13 an hour beginning in August. But we have to look, quite frankly, at the people that we are putting in positions of leadership. And relatedly, with regard to monies that are being allocated by the federal government, when the $1.9 trillion package was passed to benefit solely the wealthy in this country, there was no pushback on that. But all of a sudden, there seems to be this really bristling because literally millions of people and families across the nation are going to get needed support because of a health crisis that was not of their making. And I think we really have to have a frank conversations where we can about the morality of the ways in which people who are in positions of leadership, not all, are thinking about the people that they have been elected to serve. And I think it needs to be mentioned again that we have turned our attention obviously to the economic crisis, the impact of this economic crisis. But Babz, we know so many people in our communities especially who have suffered all their lives. who
Right.
have gone without all of their lives, who have largely been ignored and even marginalized or blamed themselves for being in the situations where they are. When what we know to be the truth is that there are structural barriers and realities that have created and fomented these unfortunate circumstances literally for generations. And that is in part why I thought it important to read the segment from State of Black America 1976 to really show how we have been looking at and trying to address these issues for generations. But it is going to require the will of the people, first of all. We've talked about the strength and power of the grassroots efforts to mobilize folks, to really hold elected officials to account, and not just believing what is being said through the platitudes that may be dispensed during campaigns. But once that person is in office, ensuring that the platforms upon which they ran to help make life a little better for people is in fact effectuated when they get into positions of power.
Mm-hmm. So when we start looking at rent income disparities, and we're starting to see all these people get evicted, where are these people going to go, and what happens? And $1,400 is not going to get them into another home.
Listen, that $1,400 will be spent as soon as it's received, because people have gotten so behind that this $1,400 can't be a one-time only. Mm-hmm. There will need to be a succession of payments during the course of this year and beyond to help people really get back on their feet. That must occur simultaneously with efforts to resuscitate the infrastructure to create jobs that pay livable wages, in addition to the understanding that whenever there is an economic constriction that may get as worse as a recession, which is what we've seen, employers have to work with far fewer employees because they simply can't afford to pay them. But one of the downsides, as bad as that is in many instances, those employees then become accustomed to having a smaller workforce. So when things begin to rebound, what you find is that the jobs that were previously available may no longer exist. That's compounded, of course, with what we have talked about in the past segments with regard to future of work and this rapid movement towards the obsolescence of many jobs, especially those that pay lower wages, $15 an hour or less. So I think that they're going to need to be concurrent efforts that are occurring as we try not only to resuscitate the economy, but we also have to work at resuscitating the quality of people's lives. And one of the things that you hear a lot is the booming of Wall Street, And Wall Street is not the economy. It is not the economy. It is not the day-to-day living and the ways that the economy impacts the quality of people's daily living. The idea of being able to put food on the table, keep your homes heated, being able to pay your rent, being able to pay your car note. I was just having this conversation with some of my students yesterday, and I was talking about the impact of not only the public health crisis that is COVID-19, but also the economic stress that can be created. So I talked about the snatch man. Now, you and I both know who the snatch man is, but none of my students did. So it was a repo. Yeah, it was repossessions. Repossessions are off the chart. And so with the disbursement of these checks must also be a concerted effort in communities in this state and around the country that are going to help to make sure that people can get access to the jobs that will be available, but also get the skill sets that they will need to be able to get access to those jobs.
So I had these women that wrote this book on the other day, Broken America, Joanne Goldblum and Colleen Shattuck. Mm-hmm. And in here they talk about car repossession, and how it is disproportionately high in poor communities.
Yes.
Because people need cars to go to work. And so what happens is they go to these pay here, buy here dealerships, and they're outrageously high and expensive. And so she talks about a case where there was a woman that was paying for three different cars, three different cars, and none of them worked because they were all lemons, and she bought them, and she had to keep paying on them because she didn't realize, she was so afraid that if she didn't pay on them, that she wouldn't be able to get another car.
And it becomes this sort of tangle of dysfunction, because you have a situation where the person may be paying, in that scenario that you just described, an interest rate that is absolutely exorbitant.
Yes.
The vehicle obviously is the depreciating asset. And who's to say if a car repair is required unexpectedly, that person will not have the resources to do it. Again, pre-COVID, according to the Federal Reserve, almost half of the respondents of that survey could not afford a $400 emergency. Now, this is pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So you could just imagine what that number may be now. But within the communities that are low income, that may be disproportionately communities of color, are nested any number of mechanisms that help to ensure that person or family remains in that place. As I've said, people from poor communities pay the most for everything.
Mm-hmm. It's expensive to be poor.
It is the most expensive to be poor. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's say that this woman that you mentioned, she's bought this car. Let's just say she bought one of the cars, but now she has to buy the car insurance.
Mm.
She's required to have comprehensive insurance because it's a newer vehicle. And the insurer provides her with several payment scenarios. As it turns out, the least expensive scenario is to pay the premium, usually 6 months in one payment. But if you do the easy payment plan, maybe 4, 5, or 6 payments, you find that the further out you make the payments, the more money you end up paying. And that is typically going to be the route that most people who have very, very resources have to take.
Mm-hmm.
And so that same type of scenario is presented to people with few to no resources in so many different areas of their lives. So when I talked about median wealth for white families being $188,000, median wealth for Latino families being $36,000, and median wealth for Black families being $24,000, we have to look behind those numbers, and we have to look at some of the structural barriers that not only support the chasm in wealth disparity, but that also promote it. And this is why, in addition to the deployment of the $1,400 or whatever the fee is that people receive, we have to be focused as much on how do we address some of the systematic barriers that have created these issues in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
and look for ways to dismantle those if we are truly committed to ensuring that every person, every family who so chooses and wants to be a part of this America has the opportunity to do so in as equitable a manner as possible.
So Dr. Brown, that sounds like two things have to happen. You have to immediately address what's happening. And then you have to have, I guess in back in the old days, it would be commission. You'd have to have a commission to set up to look at historically issues and instances of poverty. And then you've got to deal with what is happening right now, like what is in front of you. I don't know if you can do them at the same time.
Why not? I mean, it really shouldn't be a problem.
Well, because government doesn't work like that.
Well, it needs to.
I agree. Listen,
yeah,
you get
needs
no
to, and it
argument
can.
from me.
It can, and it should. But we can't.
Yeah, if you have caring people and empathetic people. But we're already hearing people. I mean, look how hard they fought Biden, this administration, just to do this $1,400 and some of the other things that are in this legislation. like some of these other groundbreaking kinds of things. I mean, it was almost as if they just didn't want people to have any hope, any opportunity to rise up from this, that they just wanted to create. I mean, it's almost like saying we're going to create a subclass of a subclass of a subclass because we're not going to do anything to help pull people up out of this, which is not of their own making.
Well, I do hope that people remember this for the midterms next year. And I do hope people remember this for the general election in 24, because to have so many people be displaced and to not wholeheartedly want to be in support of any effort that would help to address that type of an issue. It's a national security threat as well. It's not just an economic crisis, but it's also a national security threat.
Yeah.
And it may not.
And explain what you mean by that so other people will understand what that means.
Well, what I mean by that is when you have significant levels of joblessness, economic disenfranchisement that is fueled by a public health crisis, where people may not know where to turn, where to go, where no help may be available, you run the very real risk of there being a collective disbelief in the system that is democracy. And that could, in a worst case scenario, lead to just mass hysteria. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. So it's really important to assuage that type of energy by saying to the people, this is where we are. This is the severity of the issues that we face, but this is how we attempt to address it. And that is precisely what President Biden did last week. It was as if he was having a conversation with a group of close friends. And if you watch his address to the nation last week, there were even moments, Babz, where he leaned in to the camera. And that really spoke volumes to me, because it was saying to me that he understands. He was expressing empathy, and he was trying to demonstrate a connection between himself and the American people. And that's what we need now. There are so many people who have lost hope now, Babz. There are.
No,
now,
I
one
see
of the areas that we have not covered is mental health. I mean, that's a topic unto itself. But the mental health toll that the pandemic and economic crisis have taken on the American consciousness has been staggering. As a nation, we have not grieved, we have not mourned the more than 500,000 people we have lost to this disease.
Right.
On Saturday past, 1,800 people died of COVID. I mean, that is a staggering number of people. So there's so many areas of vulnerability now in the American populace that we have to be very, very deliberate in our attempts not only to address the immediacy of these issues, but also to bring to bear long-term solutions that are going to be meaningful to a variety of groups of people across the country, regardless of race, class, or region.
I mean, it's striking how, after 9/11, we had, immediately had monuments and honors going up. But, this is such a huge number across this country that we have not had time to catch our breath around how many people we've lost and are still losing.
And are still losing.
And still losing. And now that we've got some new threats around this pandemic, all these variants. And then when you look to what is going on in Europe, right? Like they're going through another lockdown. Like I think they just said, like last weekend was their last weekend, people could be like however they are, but they're about to and put back in place those strict guidelines around where you can go, what you can do, and how long you can be there. Because these variants are are out of control?
I think that it's a tremendous blessing that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has been righted by this administration, so that it is taking its place again as the leader in public health, not just here in this country, but around the world. But the guidance of the CDC is to not take a victory lap just yet. It's too soon to take the mask off. It's too soon.
But Dr. Brown, we're seeing Texas, Mississippi, Florida, we're seeing these states with these governors that are saying, we're going to lift these mandates. And some of them are suing some of the cities and towns in their states to lift mandates.
Attitude reflects leadership. And I think
haven't heard that in a long time.
It is a really bad idea to lift any, mask mandate so soon when the vaccines are just being deployed in significant numbers. We are finally seeing the numbers, generally speaking, around the country go down. But if people go back to life before COVID so quickly, we will replicate what's going on in European countries.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't have to be that way. So when the president spoke last week about potentially having a real celebration this coming 4th of July, that is very possible. But it means that every person has to do their part. It means that we must engage in health protective behaviors. That is, wearing a mask, engaging in social distancing, practicing proper hygiene. Those are still as important now as they were 6 months ago. Because if we're really going to put this disease in check, understanding that there will be variants of the disease, which we've already begun to see, we have to make sure that we can get to that place of herd immunity by vaccinating 70% or so of the U.S. population.
What I find interesting, Dr. Brown, is that people don't take they don't see that we have pretty much wiped out flu. Like, I think that's a more compelling example of why we do this, because we weren't thinking about flu and all of this, but look what we have done by simply following these kinds of protocols of wiping out flu. Less than 200 people in the whole country have died from flu, as opposed to thousands of people.
But you have to look at over time the emergence of vaccines for the flu shot. You have to look at the ways in which people perceive the flu. Now, you can still die from influenza, but what do you hear in the fall, Babz? You hear people talking all the time, well, I got to get my flu shot. So that has been baked into the thought processes of so many people around the country, that to get a flu shot is not an infringement on a person's civil rights, as has been promoted during this time with COVID-19, which is simply not well-reasoned thinking.
Yeah.
So if we're able to move beyond the rhetoric and the politicization of getting the vaccine, masking up, practicing social distancing and proper hygiene, I think that we will begin to see more buy-in with regard to engaging in those health protective behaviors, but also, as soon as you can and it's available to you, getting that vaccination. And I think that that's going to have to be a personal decision that can be influenced by the public health departments within the 50 states, that is reinforced obviously at the gubernatorial level, but that ultimately resonates with people, families, and communities in such a way where we want to preserve life, not potentially place it at risk. And so I think that as more people get the vaccination, I think that you will begin to see more of a momentum of people who too want to get the vaccination, as opposed to those who feel that to get the vaccine, to mask up and to practice social distancing and the like is an infringement.
That's quite interesting. Well, I'm waiting for that because as someone who has a compromised immune system, the quicker that we get to herd immunity, the safer I am.
Yes. So there are a number of benefits to getting that vaccine. As it's been said, our bodies have no immunity to COVID-19, and this is what makes us so susceptible. So if you look at the idea of what this piece of legislation does, it also will provide health insurance at a significantly reduced rate to millions of people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the question I have is, who could possibly be against something like that?
And they were, though. I mean, you saw them. I mean, you saw them filibustering to not allow states to open up their health exchanges so that people could get on health insurance because people lost their jobs or whatever, and extend it. I mean, Connecticut, we've extended ours, like opened it up, extended it, all of that. But there were people who were willing to sort of do that, which I don't understand. In the middle of a pandemic, why would you want people not to have access to health insurance?
It's indifference. It's indifference to the suffering of so many people. And there has been a concerted effort to not address the issues of the poor. So again, we've talked about Reverend Dr. William Barber and the fine work that he's doing with the Poor People's Campaign. You find that during political campaigns, there is usually no talk about the circumstances that poor people face. It's always about the middle class, the middle class, the middle class. We know that.
And here's the thing: poor people are consistently the ones that vote. Poor people are the ones that are consistently out here pulling people together. They do all the organizing. I mean, poor people are the backbone of everything. I'm not no shame to the middle class, but it is on the backs of poor people that this country runs.
Well, and you're absolutely right. But the wrinkle to that, Babz, is that there are many in poor communities who sometimes vote against their own interest.
Oh, yeah.
And so even as we have seen the people who voted for this bill, Democrats -1, and then no Republicans voted for it, there are many people in poor communities who will vote to keep the very people who voted against what would help them and allow them to remain in office. So so these issues are complex. But now we're in a time where we have to really decide once and for all what type of nation we're going to be. Is this going to be a nation for the haves and have-mores at the expense of everyone else? Or is this going to be a nation where we are, through policy, providing mechanisms, services, programs, and empowerment that is going to not just lift people who are in poor communities up for a temporary amount of time, but place them in positions where they can remain lifted. So I'm hoping that this is a conversation that is already happening in state houses, certainly at the federal level, because now is the time. What we have seen over the past year is that so many more people have been thrust into poverty. So when you see those food line banks that may stretch for miles, and you see those high-end cars in those lines, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. So we have to use this as an opportunity to really face the ills of society. Again, we have so much potential and there's a great opportunity here, but we have to be willing to look at the truth, and we have to be willing to critically assess not just the attitudes and perspectives of those with whom we disagree, but we also have to critically assess those of our own as we are in this work to help make things better.
All right, then I think this is where we're going to leave this conversation for now. And I'm glad that I get a chance to talk about this housing component because I think as we watch people being evicted, and I believe there's money in this legislation that will help people get access to bringing their rents current. I just hope it gets to enough people in time, so that they, that we don't have all these people in the streets, all these people looking for housing. 'Cause that just would not be a good look.
Yeah, and I hope too that there have been mechanisms that are put in place to make sure that people who are unbanked get their money as quickly as possible.
Oh,
and
yes.
that's
Yes.
that's another dimension to this that I've not heard much conversation, but that needs to be a part of this, because otherwise, if you are unbanked, forget about not having direct deposit, then you're potentially looking at not receiving that money until sometime in April, maybe.
Yeah.
And people need the help now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. It's always a pleasure having you here. Now, I'm away for a few weeks.
Yes.
After this week.
Yeah.
So I won't be back till I think the second week of April. But I'll definitely be back in touch with you before, so we can set up more of these conversations.
Yeah, and I'll be in communication with you while you're away.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
This
always
has
good
really
to be with
been
you.
enjoyable.
Yeah, I've
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it too.
I so appreciate these conversations, and other people will appreciate them too. I want you to
good to know.
So enjoy your rest of your week, and thank you so much, Dr. Robert Brown.
Okay, and continue to be well.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, Harry, I know you want to get these call letters in. You got about 2 minutes. See, I did that right today.
Hi, this is Babz Rawls-Ivy from New Haven, Connecticut, and you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, streaming live at newhavenindependent.org.